As scenic rivers flow past limestone bluffs through southwest Missouri, and the hills and hollers of the Ozarks fade into the fields and farms that mark the start of prairie land, here was where settlers from Kentucky, Tennessee, and the Carolinas found a new home. And what else would you call a place where fertile fields roll out like an emerald carpet from the forest and foothills? This is Greenfield.
Very agricultural. Greenfield was a small town, but if you look back at the history of it, it was a very prosperous place and a lot of kind of a booming town.
Kent Parrish is a local historian who spent the better part of 30 years teaching history in school. And he's still teaching now about the importance of preserving history, like Dade County's Holston Mill site, where you can still catch a glimpse of what life was like for those first to call this corner of the Show Me State home. The town of Greenfield grew quickly after its founding in 1841. The first courthouse was finished the following year as Greenfield became the county seat of Dade County, Missouri. The current courthouse is a far cry from its earlier ancestors, one of which was burned to the ground by Confederate soldiers during the Civil War, a conflict that divided this rural community.
I think the county was divided. John Holston said the southern part of the county went primarily Confederate and the northern part was primarily for the Union. But yeah, there were a lot of people. There was a Dade County Mounted Home Guard that was organized, and they took over the mill, and they used the mill to feed Lyon's troops in Springfield.
As the scars of war healed, Greenfield continued to grow. But it lacked one thing that a growing town just had to have in those twilight years of the 19th century.
Pretty much every county seat in Missouri has an opera house.
In August of 1888, the building dubbed the Jewel of the Square opened to the public.
In the pre-internet age and pre-TV and pre-radio, it was a place that people came. There was entertainment, there were speakers, it was a place for the community to come together.
At the time, Greenfield was a much more metropolitan area than it is today. There were colleges, newspapers, restaurants, drugstores, hardware stores, and hotels. And of course, the Opera House.
It's a real 19th century thing. I mean, it's hard to imagine now, how active the square would have been, how much people would have been involved in towns.
The Opera House was built from bricks made in the Greenfield brickyard. And the ornate facade with its terracotta faces looking down on the town square were certainly a sight to see when the doors opened for its first production, Passion's Slave, by the Chicago Theater Company. As the popularity grew, so did the performances, drawing in the best of vaudeville, theater companies, and other top performers of the day.
You look at a list of who came here, I mean, it's fascinating. John William Boone, who was known as Blind Boone, a famous Missouri musician, came here and played ragtime.
Blind from birth, John William Boone was an African-American pianist whose legendary skills made him one of the founding fathers of ragtime and early jazz. Boone's performance in Greenfield gave him access to the main auditorium of the Opera House, though in a time of racial segregation, any African Americans that wanted to hear him were relegated to their own theater space on the third floor.
You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold.
Speakers like William Jennings Bryan, who ran for president 3 times, he was part of the Chautauqua circuit. He came here and spoke.
The Opera House also hosted celebrities of the era, long before you could turn a knob or push a button to welcome them into your living room.
It would have just been the center of activity. People weren't at home watching TV or on the internet. They came up to the square.
In 1919, the Opera House Auditorium would host a different crowd when the orphan train made a stop in Greenfield. The orphan trains were an effort to move abandoned children from crowded urban areas like New York City westward, where they were then adopted.
They would send ahead to a place like Greenfield and say you have to have a committee of ministers and doctors and lawyers, and they were supposed to screen families, and then they would bring these kids in on the train, and families would get to pick them out.
Elizabeth Wild Daniel described her childhood memories of arriving in Greenfield to the National Orphan Train Complex Museum and Research Center.
When we got to the Opera House, it was packed. Our agent was a Methodist preacher, Mr. J.W. Swan. He was crippled and couldn't drive. He announced we were tired. Those interested in us could take us home, feed us, talk it over, and keep us on trial.
The 20th century would usher in more changes to Greenfield. Across the street from the Opera House, the Dade County Courthouse was rebuilt as part of the Works Progress Administration. But for all the improvements that came to the town, it seemed as though there was no place for the Opera House in this ever-changing new society.
Think about all the factors, even things as simple as air conditioning. I mean, it affects how people live and what they do.
The curtain seemed closed for good on the once majestic Greenfield Opera House. But like any good drama, this story had a second act.
The building was really in bad condition, and we would come up and work through the week after I got off work, and sometimes we'd sweep, sometimes I've scrubbed floors, even in this room, to try to get the dust down, because it had been years and years since the upstairs of this building was used.
Pat McKinley was one of a small group of community members who joined together in the late 1980s to see if they could resurrect the old Opera House. Shares were sold to invest in the restoration, just like shares were sold in the 1880s to fund its initial construction. The goal, to bring art and culture back to this tiny Midwestern town. Thus, the Dade County Community Theater was born, and in August 1988, 100 years after the Opera House first opened, the community of Greenfield returned for its triumphant grand reopening.
It was pretty warm, and I'm not sure that we had our air conditioning then. We had the old-time ceiling fans that came from the tall ceilings, which stirred the air, and I think we had some windows open. Some of these large windows were open, and everybody was really excited.
The first production for this second act of the Greenfield Opera House, a tribute to the last major event to cross the stage, a play, Orphan Train West, a dramatic retelling of the lives of the children who were transported to new homes in the West.
I think the whole auditorium was full, and everybody was excited about their part in the play and how the play was going to go and if anybody was going to come and that type of thing.
With the first performance a resounding success, work continued on restoring the 100-year-old building as more productions were planned.
They opened it up. My husband Ed was in a play in 1988, The Orphan Train, and it was rough. I mean, rough. The walls hadn't been plastered. Actually, they didn't even have the backstage there. You saw the windows when you saw the play.
Kathy Kocha and her husband Ed adopted the Opera House and the Dade County Community Theater.
My favorite thing to do was to sit in the audience and laugh and clap appropriately.
There were your standard stage plays put on, but Ed brought something more.
Ed did a lot of plays for us. He wrote original plays.
Well, of course, my very favorite is Three Women Named Dave.
Ed liked to write funny things in his plays, and they were serious content, but he always had a comical part in it.
Me and Pat McKinley and Donisa, we were the three women, and it was about Ed wrote the play, and it was about they had found this fountain of youth, and when I drank it, then my character turned to a young person, and that was my daughter, who was 8 years old at the time.
Ed had a knack for making an audience laugh, and on a shoestring budget provided Southwest Missouri with a chance to go to the theater and see live performances.
He did a lot of the props for us. He would make backgrounds on the stage, and it would look like bookshelves with books on them. You almost had to touch it to realize that it was just a painting or a prop.
Local actors, writers, and directors performing on a stage that once hosted the stars of a bygone era brought a little life back to the half-abandoned town square.
He kept the Opera House going. He and Kathy both.
Yeah. It was more than just entertainment. Ed Kocha had a gift, a gift for finding the best in others and giving them the opportunity to shine.
I remember there was a couple ladies, a regular theater person wouldn't have chosen them. And they would say to me, I've always dreamed of being on stage. And Ed would take them and give them the right parts, and they would be stars. And they would go, that would touch them for the rest of their life, you know?
For 20 years, the Dade County Community Theater brought comedy and drama to this tiny Ozarks community. But the Opera House's resurrection was to be short-lived. Mother Nature dealt the first blow. A spring storm wiped the ornately crafted letters spelling out the word tragedy from the building's facade, seemingly foreshadowing its future. Time would move in for the kill. After 2 decades, children who grew up on stage moved away, interest in performing faded, and a slowing economy would hit all of Dade County hard. By the early 2000s, it was the final curtain call for the Dade County Community Theater, and it seemed quite likely for the Opera House as well.
He'd always tell me, put on a good show. And that was his big thing, is put on, whatever you do, put on a good show.
More than 120 years after the first bricks were laid, those bricks started to fall. The building seemed beyond repair. At least it was far beyond the repair budget of the core group that had supported the theater all those years. Ed Kocha knew the show must go on, but how?
We were doing a remodel project for my business partner's wife here, and the metal was falling off the front of the building. I volunteered 3 weeks to go up, repair the metal, get it reattached, get it cleaned out.
Ed and Kathy appealed to David Rhodes's passion for historical restorations, but with the back wall already visibly swaying, it was a tall order.
And at the time, I had no desire. I felt like it was too far gone, the town was too far gone.
What David Rhodes didn't know, you don't tell Ed and Kathy Kocha something is impossible. They would convince him and his building partner to buy the Opera House with a promise to restore it.
No, the whole building, other than the theater group, that, without them, the building would have already failed. But yeah, it's been almost a vacant building for years and years and years.
The transformation, nothing short of miraculous.
This is the only area that's been changed in the entire building. Used to be a doorway going out that way, a hall, and 3 big dressing rooms that were just interconnected all the way through this room, which we got approval for everything we've done through the National Historical Society, the state, and the local historical society.
Keeping the history alive.
This building had no electricity when it was open, no gas. It had kerosene lighting all the way through, and that's the original kerosene lights.
Original chairs made for the Greenfield Opera House are now back to welcoming patrons of live performances. And while it may not be unused, the cast iron stove made in 1876 and hoisted to the Opera House's auditorium in 1888 is literally one of a kind, as are the marks made by more than 100 years worth of performers.
Here's a lot of the signatures, and they date back to 1890 is one of the oldest ones we've found so far.
It wasn't just about saving an old theater. Downstairs, the Intermission Cafe brought commerce back to the first floor of the Opera House, and a touch of elegance with a grand staircase leading up to the remodeled auditorium.
You look around this building, some tall windows, tall ceilings, nobody would, unless you're extremely wealthy, would have a home like that. But it was very practical, it's better in the summertime that way.
And what a better time for a grand reopening than when there's already a party in town. Greenfield's annual Buffalo Day celebration, held every Memorial Day weekend, brings the community together and invites back those wayward sons and daughters for a visit. Only on this weekend, they would return home to a Greenfield town square that's seen an injection of new life for the first time in decades, embracing the past for the future.
I can remember when I was a little kid, I mean, this is one of my most vivid memories of going down the road and seeing old buildings and think, boy, somebody ought to save that building. It's just, I guess, something I was born with, trying to rehab and save old buildings, especially when they're historic.
Now, on its third life, 130 years after opening for the first performers, the second generation of actors, writers, and directors from the Dade County Community Theater Company found their way back home. A reunion to remember and a chance to share in the wonder of the return of the jewel of the square.
Yes, it's great. It just brings back a lot of memories of what it used to be, and now what it is so much greater. And I'm wondering when it was first built if it was something like this.
But even with all that had been done, there was something missing from the Opera House's restoration celebration. Ed Kocha.
I'm actually very sad that Ed's not here to see us all this now, but you know, he did a good start. He brought her in for 22 years.
Though through his plays he had saved the world and taken audiences on impossible adventures, cancer took Ed from the place he loved and from those who loved him. He passed away just a few months before seeing live performances return to the Opera House stage. But on this summer afternoon, it was clear Ed may have been gone, but he was most certainly not forgotten.
Whereas members of the Missouri Senate always welcome the opportunity to acknowledge milestone events in the histories of the Show Me State, communities that have proven to be simply places in which to live, work, and raise families. Whereas the newly refurbished Greenfield Opera House will be renamed as the Ed and Kathy Kocha Theater.
It's been said, all the world's a stage, and the men and women merely players upon it. But for Ed Kocha, this stage was his world. Whether it be with 3 women named Dave finding the fountain of youth, or a group of children heading off to a magical underwater ranch of wet cows, Ed's legacy lives on. And not just in the new name of this stage he set and saved for future shows, but in the lives of all those performers he invested in and believed in.
We're making a difference. It's making a difference, that's what it's all about, and I think we did.
Yes, it's true. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man, in his time, plays many parts. As for the future of the Opera House, David Rhodes isn't finished with his restoration. There's much more of the Opera House left to open, and the building has more stories to tell and more history to reveal.
It's real important to me. I mean, I feel like it's almost destiny, and my goal is to have a trust fund for this building that will do the maintenance on it from now on.
The Opera House now stands as a monument for a new generation to remember how their community came together to build something grand, and how their community came together again to save what was nearly lost.
Maybe people begin to realize what they've lost. I don't know, we've certainly had our history in this country has been a migration to cities, but maybe people kind of long for something their parents had or they had as they were children, maybe. These things seem maybe more valuable as you get older, I don't know.
As for this third act of the Greenfield Opera House, well, the story isn't quite finished, but it seems like it just might be a happy ending.